Hello and welcome back to our channel. My name is Femke from Femke the Fiction on Instagram and Bookish Buddies over on Twitter. And today I am here with my Trope-ical Readathon TBR. Now it has been a little while since I've uploaded my last video. I've actually filmed quite a few, but I just never edited or uploaded them, which is also one of the reasons why my setup is different. I rearranged my room, so my bookcases are in a different position now. I actually did a bookshelf reorganization, put everything in rainbow shelves, but I just could not cope. I couldn't find anything I wanted to read, and it was stressing me out, so I changed everything back. So now it's back to my trusty alphabetical order by author's last name. Enough about that. Today, as I said, I am here with my Trope-ical Readathon TBR. Now, the Trope-ical Readathon is a month-long readathon running from August 1st until the 31st of August. And for this readathon, you will read books based on tropes. For the Trope-ical Readathon, there are 5 teams of which you will choose one, and for that team, you will be collecting points. Those points can be collected through a couple of different things. There are 13 common challenges or prompts, which are worth 50 points each. Then there are 2 team-specific challenges, which depends on the team you've chosen. Those are worth 100 points each. Then there's the group book, which I will get to in a second, which is worth 150 points. And then you get another point per page you've read. So even if I were to read, I don't know, a 1,000-page book that did not fulfill any of the prompts, I would still get 1,000 points for that book alone. As I've mentioned, there are 5 teams you could choose from. The teams are romance, science fiction, fantasy, horror, thriller, and mystery. There's contemporary, literary, and historical fiction, and then there's non-fiction and poetry. I chose team science fiction fantasy, obviously, and because it is the only book I don't have yet, I will start my TBR with the group book. Now, let me say, I have ordered it. It should arrive today, though it also may not. Post offices everywhere and postal services are a mess, so I'm really not sure whether it will actually be arriving today. I hope it will. Otherwise, I hope it'll arrive tomorrow. In any way, I hope it arrives before the readathon starts on August 1st. The group book is Cinderella is Dead by Kaylin Bayron. I have to admit, I have seen this book, float by a couple of times. And every time I saw it, I thought it was a contemporary. And I don't really read contemporary, so I just wrote it off as, nah, it's not for me. But as it turns out, it is actually a fantasy book, and I have read the synopsis by now, and I'm really intrigued about this. Again, like I mentioned, there are 2 group-specific challenges and then 13 common challenges. And I will first show you the picks for the group-specific. Now, for all of the common prompts, there is basically a choice you can make. You can either choose to read a book with the given trope, or there is another prompt attached to it, which you can choose alternatively. You can choose either one of the 2. But for the group-specific challenges, it is only the trope that you can choose from. So basically you can't choose. Okay, so the first group-specific challenge or trope was Magical Academy, which is of course to read a book which features a magical academy. Because I was trying to actually only pick books that I own and that I haven't read yet, this was actually a pretty difficult challenge, because of course things that first come to mind are Harry Potter, Vampire Academy, those kinds of things, but I've actually already read all those. So it was by far for me the most difficult challenge to find a book fitting this trope. I kind of found one, and that book is To Best the Boys by Mary Weber. This book is about a girl who participates in basically a magical labyrinth. Basically, in this book, all the male inhabitants of a small town are invited to participate in a competition to obtain a scholarship for one of the most prestigious universities around, but like I said, it's only the boys. Now, our main character actually decides to take matters into her own hands, and she participates to be able to obtain the scholarship. So yeah, as I said, this was by far the most difficult problem for me to find a book for, but this does feature magic, I believe, or at least it's like paranormal, and there's kind of an academy, so this is like really the closest thing I have on my shelves, which I could possibly choose for this, which I haven't read yet. So the next team-specific trope to read a book for was time travel, and I have to admit, I didn't even really remember I had this book. Well, I remembered I had the book, but I had no idea what it was about, so I was really surprised that it actually fit this prompt so well. But the book I will be reading for this is Passenger by Alexandra Bracken. Now, like I said, I really don't know a lot about this book, but apparently it features time travel, because when I googled YA books with time travel, this was one of the first ones that popped up. So I was really surprised actually, because with most of my books I must have read the synopsis at some point because I bought it, so I must have found it interesting, but I just never read it. So this is going to be a theme for this video, is because I have quite a few older books on this. Also quite a few reasonably new books, but I think it's a really nice mix of both old and new. Okay, so moving on to the common tropes. The first trope on this list is dead absent parents, or alternatively you could choose to read a book written by multiple authors. I believe that the book I've chosen actually fits both. I'm not entirely sure because I haven't read it, but I think the parents are basically absent, if not dead. I mean, I don't know. But the book I will be reading for this is Aurora Rising by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. This has basically been on my TBR ever since it came out. Well, ever since before it came out, but you can't really read it then. But this is of course a science fiction in which a ragtag bunch of people are basically having to save the world, and if I remember correctly, it doesn't actually go very well. But yeah, I believe like the tagline for this was, "They're not the heroes we want, but it's the best we could find," something like that, and I was really intrigued by that. But yeah, like I said, I believe these main characters, well, they have parents, but their parents are absent or maybe even dead, I don't know. And it was written by two people, so it definitely fits the second prompt. So the next trope to read a book for was strange names, or alternatively you could read a book starting with the first letter of your first name, which for me is obviously an F. This was also quite a struggle. I mean, if you think about it, there's not that many books that actually start with an F. I mean, they're there. Don't get me wrong, they exist, but they're not very many. If you then start looking for books that I actually own, and books that I haven't read yet, but also, you know, books that aren't a part of a series of which I'm not quite yet, there are really very few. There are, I think, I have 500 books here on my shelves. In the end, there were 3 books that fit the criteria, which was essentially starting with an F, on my shelves, and haven't read it yet. And the book I chose will probably surprise you, surprise me. That is Follow Me Down by Tanya Byrne. This book has been on my TBR for like literal years. I've had it for years. It's just been sitting there for years. It's made its way through dozens of rounds of unhauling, so obviously it must have been intriguing enough for me to keep. Which is why I've decided to give this book a chance. Like I said, this is one of the older books. I'm not sure what year this is from. So this was published in 2013, so I think it may have actually been on my shelf as long as that. Yeah, this is not entirely fantasy. It is about 2 girls becoming best friends until essentially they fall for the same guy. After which, of course, the rivalry ensues until the best friend goes missing. The main character then has to, of course, figure out what happened to her best friend, and it turns out that the best friend was caught up in lots of different sinister things. So yeah, like I said, I was really intrigued by this book. It definitely deserves this chance. So the next trope was to read a book with an outbreak or a pandemic, or alternatively you could read a book that was part of a series. I've thought about it, but I really don't think I have any books that feature an outbreak. Especially not ones that I haven't read yet. That's always kind of the thing here. So I went to read a book that was part of a series. And the book I chose is called Pain. Well, actually it's called The Empire of Gold, but I'm pretty sure it will cause me lots of pain. But this is of course the final book in the Daevabad trilogy, After the City of Brass and the Kingdom of Copper, and this is one of my most anticipated releases of the year. I've had this for a couple of weeks. I've just not dared to start reading it because of, you know, expected pain. I really think it's time for me to read this. As you can see, I haven't really chosen small books. Every single prompt has been fulfilled by a full-length book, so I have no idea how many I'll get to, but I'll try my best. But yeah, like I said, this is easily one of my most anticipated releases. I also predict it will be a 5-star read, even though it will probably destroy me. The next trope was to read a book with a forbidden romance or forbidden love. Or alternatively, you could read a book that is or was or has been banned. I went with the trope for this one, and the book I've chosen to read is Nightshade by Andrea Cremer. This is one of those books, again, that has been on my TBR for years, and I just never read it. I believe this is about a girl who is also a werewolf and who is destined to become the pack leader's wife or mate. Whatever you want to call it. But then on one fated day, night, she saves a beautiful boy from harm, and chaos ensues, romance ensues, forbidden love, there you have it. Apart from that, I really don't know much about the book. I didn't really know it featured forbidden romance as well. Again, I googled YA forbidden romance books, and then it turned out that I actually had read lots and lots of forbidden romance books. I also own them, but again, I've also already read them. This is one that I haven't read yet, and I'm actually pretty excited to be getting into this one. Partly because it's also been on my TBR for years. Then the next trope was to read a dystopia, or alternatively to read a book with over 500 pages. I chose to read a dystopia novel, and the book I chose was The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. Again, this is one of those books that's been on my TBR for years, and I'm really happy that I can actually, you know, I actually seem to be making progress with that at this point. But yeah, this is set in the year, I believe it's like 2059 or something. And of course the world broke down, and now they live in a entirely different world, which is called a dystopia. Apart from that, I really don't know much about that, except for that the main character's name is Paige Mahoney. But I believe Paige gets kidnapped, and then lots of stuff happens. If you hadn't noticed yet, I suck at giving synopsis, so it would probably be best for you if you just went to Goodreads to check out these synopses for yourself. But anyway, again, this has been on my TBR for a super long time. I'm really excited to be getting into this. So the next trope to read a book for was to read a book for Blast from the Past, which essentially meant that, you know, the main character encounters someone from their past, which I actually found out, you know, after I actually already chose my book, but I still decided to go with my book. But that was for the alternative prompt, which was to read a book from a different generation, by which they meant to read a book from before 2000. I'm not making this easy on myself, because the book I chose for this prompt is A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin, which is of course the second book in the Game of Thrones series. It's not a trilogy, it's a series. This is over 1,000 pages, at least in my edition. I don't really think I need to tell you much about this, but again, I've had these books for years, and I've actually finished Lord of the Rings last week. It's time for me to also read this series, which I will be doing, hopefully, next month. The next trope was to read a book in mixed media format, or alternatively to read listen to an audiobook. I don't particularly like audiobooks. I don't hate them. Like, they've massively helped me out with Lord of the Rings, because I just don't really like the writing style. But overall, I just prefer to be able to read things for myself. So I wanted to do a book with mixed media. And then you can see these babies peeking out from the top. Illuminae would have been the perfect fit for this prompt, but I've already read them, which is a theme in this video. So I went with something by the same author. I've actually asked organizing the readathon if it was okay, because I just really couldn't find anything else. And the book I chose for this prompt was God's Grave, which is the second book in the Nevernight Chronicle. Now with God's Grave, you might not actually immediately think of mixed media, but it has footnotes, which are not used in the usual footnote style. So I've asked this if it was okay, and they said it was. So that is why I decided to go with this. This book is also on my series I want to finish in 2020 list, so that is an added bonus. The next trope on this list was artificial intelligence, or alternatively you could read a book in an ebook format. The book I went with for this prompt was Starsight by Brandon Sanderson, which is the second book in the Skyward series, I think. Anyway, I recently finished Skyward, and while I didn't really love it, I really did like it. There's a sentient spaceship in this book, which is of course artificial intelligence, and I'm really curious to see how the first book, or how this book will, you know, continue after the events of the first book. So the next trope was to read a book featuring amnesia, or alternatively to read a book on your TBR that you forgot about. I've chosen a book that kind of fits both prompts, and that is Revelations by G.A. Souders. This is the second book in the Renegades trilogy, and in the first book our main character is actually continuously reset, so she's made to forget who she is and what she's discovered. So while this particular book, well, it also features some amnesia, but not as much as the first book. But yeah, I thought this counted anyway, and it is also a book that I basically forgot I had. I mean, in the back of my head I knew I had it, but it just really went to a back burner because it's been, again, years since I read the first one. The next trope was to read a book featuring enemies to lovers, or alternatively to read a book you previously DNF'd. Anyone who knows me knows I don't really DNF books. I may put them aside for a while, but I will nearly always finish the books I start. Like, a book has to be spectacularly bad for me to DNF it. Obviously, I was going to go with the enemies to lovers trope, which is one of my favorite tropes in the entire world. Which is why it was reasonably difficult for me to find a book that I own, that I haven't read yet, that fit the prompt. But I did. And the book I chose to read for this is Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. I know this features grimoires. I think it's like a demon cat. Sorcerers, enemies to lovers, which sounds like everything I will love. So I'm really excited to be getting into this book. The next trope was to read a book featuring the chosen one, or to read a book that was recommended to you. The book I've chosen for this is to read a book for the chosen one prompt, and the book I've chosen is Chosen Ones. That was a very difficult sentence. This is, of course, by Veronica Roth, who is the author of Divergent. This is a new series. It is her first adult series. And this is about a bunch of people who saved the world in years gone by, only for them to find out that they actually haven't really saved the world, only delayed the process. So the chosen ones, the chosen children, will need to fight again. I'm really intrigued by this synopsis, and though I've heard mixed things, I'm still pretty excited about this. The next trope was the new kid in town, and the alternative prompt was to read a book in a genre you don't really read, you don't often read. And the book I've chosen for this is The Strings of Murder by Oscar de Muriel. This is a historical murder mystery. It's set in Edinburgh in 1888. This is set at the same time as Jack the Ripper. I have to say I've already read the first chapter because there was a challenge for a friend of mine, but I've never continued past the first chapter, and I am pretty curious. I love Agatha Christie's books, so those murder mysteries, so I think there's a really good chance I will also love this. And it's a genre I don't usually read. I mean, obviously, I usually read fantasy or science fiction, so this was actually the perfect book for this. And it's also not super big in, you know, by contrast to some of the other books on here. And then we have arrived at the final book on my TBR. Like, I know my TBR is both massive, excessive, and I probably won't be able to read all of these, but I still loved making this TBR. But the final trope was to read a retelling, or alternatively to read a book with either a movie or a TV series adaptation. I've chosen to go with a retelling, and I've chosen to read House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. This is a retelling of the 12 Princesses, if I am not mistaken. And this is about a family whose daughters have been cursed to basically die off one by one. And each death is more tragic than the other, than the previous one. Sorry, it's the 12 Dancing Princesses. This sounds really spooky, it sounds really like atmospheric, and it sounds like I love the setting, which is part of the reason I chose to put this on my TBR for this month. Like I said, with all of these books, I'm pretty excited to read this. Okay, so those were all of the books on my TBR. There's 16 books on my TBR. Of course, there's 15 here, as I mentioned before. Cinderella is Dead should be coming today. And to round off this video, I have one final announcement to make. And that is that I will be hosting sprints for the Trope-ical Readathon. For that, I will link that down below. It will be on the Trope-ical Sprints Twitter page. It will not be on the main feed, but there will be, I believe, 8 people hosting sprints along with me. And for the full schedule, you should keep an eye on Twitter because Jen and Rob will announce that over on the Trope-ical Readathon Twitter. So yeah, I think that was everything for this video. I know it's a long one, and if you've managed to hold out till this point, kudos. If you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up or even a follow. Then you can also hit the bell icon so you'll be notified every single time that we post. Leave a comment down below if you are also participating in the Trope-ical Readathon and then what your TBR is. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!